We are in Acts chapter 23. Acts chapter 23. We have been studying how that Paul has made his defense in chapter 22 to those Jews of Jerusalem who had gathered to judge him and condemn him, kill him was their plan. However large that multitude was, he addressed them on the steps of Antonia. He has been taken. Paul originally was going to be scourged. According to something I read, 7 out of 10 men who were scourged by Rome, even under times of interrogation, 7 out of 10 were killed just by that process of that scourging. So the odds were not good for Paul in terms of his physical well-being if he underwent that scourging. But anyway, Paul brought up the fact that he was a Roman citizen. And there were actually, we talked about two of the ways in which a Roman or a person could be made a citizen. One was to be born from their father had to be a citizen. And we talked about that last week. I did narrow down that point, is that it could not come from the mother. It had to come from the father. And the second one was you could purchase your freedom, purchase your citizenship. But there was a third, being born from a free city. Of course, Tarsus certainly was a large city. It was an important city, but it wasn't considered one of the free cities in which if you were born, you were automatically free. So Paul's citizenship came through his father, which would have been someone who was of presumably Greek or Gentile origin. So we get here into chapter 23. Lysias, the commander, has brought Paul before the Sanhedrin because he needs answers. He does not understand why the people were so upset. Lysias may have a base understanding of the Jews and their heritage and their belief structure, but it is not in depth enough. It is not a complex understanding well enough to understand what the issue is with Paul and the people, especially concerning the Gentiles. So he's brought him before the Sanhedrin. We started last week we got to about verse 2 and verse 3 of chapter 23. Paul mentions the fact that he has stood in good conscience before God up until that day, and including that day, through that day. Even when he was persecuting the church, he believed he was doing so according to the instruction of the old law. Again, Paul did not have yet an understanding that the old law had been put away. So if the old law was indeed still in effect in terms of the spiritual aspects of the old law, if Christ had not instituted the New Testament, he would have been doing that which was commanded under the old law, as far as he knew he was doing what was right. Notice in verse 2, Ananias, the high priest, commands those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. We talked about a couple of the scenarios as to why Ananias would command this to be done. Whether it was the idea that, and again, I don't necessarily think Paul was accusing them of not having a clean conscience or of doing things without the right motivation, although that could very well have been why Ananias had him struck, is that he interpreted this as an accusation against the Sanhedrin and perhaps even Ananias himself. But Paul, I believe, was really making this as a defense, that the accusations put against him, especially those pertaining to the law of Moses from a civil perspective. You know, the accusations that were made against him, granted, incorporated spiritual aspects, but Paul, because of his obedience and his submission to the civil aspects of the law, would never have done, much less as a Christian still, would never have done what he was accused of doing, in addition to speaking against Moses and against the people and against the temple, bringing a Gentile into the temple. So, in verse 3, Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? Keep in mind, Paul, first of all, from the Roman perspective, from the Roman law, he's not accused. There's nothing that has been accused of Paul. So, for all intents and purposes, he's under protective custody, kind of how we would say it today. That's really what it boils down to, is that Lysias is kind of keeping Paul because he has to find out what's going on. If he releases Paul, the Jews are going to take him, okay, and they're going to try to kill him. Likely, if Lysias tries to intervene again, there might very well be a riot. So Lysias cannot release Paul, but at the same time, by Roman law, he can't keep him arrested. So really, the only real way for him to get around this is to say, okay, I've got to protect Paul because he's a Roman citizen, and that certainly would be a part of the law as well, and to recognize that in this particular case, I need to have an accusation. I can't keep him without accusing him. Or having something against him, whether it was under Roman law or, in this case, that's why he's coming to the Sanhedrin, under Jewish law. So, in verse 3, notice how that Paul is struck. And Paul says this is contrary to the law of Moses. Because again, even under the law of Moses, Paul hasn't been accused of anything yet. Okay, he was the hearsay of these accusations of the Jews from Asia Minor, okay, talking about bringing Trophimus into the temple and the other accusations associated with that. But there was no proof, no evidence given. There's no due process. A due process was certainly a part of the law of Moses as much as it was of the Roman law. And as a result, when Ananias commanded those around him to strike him, this was, in effect, a sentencing by Ananias to Paul without any due process. Okay. Whatever Ananias perceived Paul's statement as being, that he lived in all good conscience before God until that day. However it was that Ananias perceived the meaning of that, it would seem to have angered him to the point that Ananias didn't care about due process. Whether or not this was a special case, I would like to think and like to hope that the Sanhedrin generally had acknowledgement of the law in these cases, and that the high priest, being kind of the example, the one that everybody kind of followed his lead, so to speak, with regard to the application of the law of Moses, you would hope under normal circumstances Ananias would not be this short-leashed or this temperamental regarding things that people say when they're being examined by the Sanhedrin. Because it's Paul, it's possible that either his reputation is coming into play here. Again, the interpretation of this may very well have been Ananias thought that Paul's saying, hey, I'm innocent. The rest of you, though, are you in good conscience? Have you all done things with the proper motivation? That might very well be how Ananias took this. But either way, when Paul responds, he accuses him of being a whitewashed wall. Yeah, you try to promote yourself as being holy and godly before everybody else, but you're a hypocrite. Because while you seem to promote the law and you seem to promote righteousness, you do those things, command those things in this case to be done contrary to the law, which we see there in verse 3. So anything through verse 3 so far? All right, verse 4. So we see in verse 4, those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? And in verse 5, Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So, Paul didn't realize Ananias is serving as the high priest at this point. There's a couple of elements to this in the background. Sorry, I'm talking around my cough drop here. So, according to the law, you were not supposed to speak against your rulers. What Paul said, while Paul himself acknowledges that this was not a proper thing for me to do, what Paul said wasn't wrong. Okay, the content of what he said was correct. And certainly Ananias was being a hypocrite by a command, at least under the law of Moses, by commanding this to be done to Paul. But the fact that he's the high priest, Paul, I wouldn't say he was reviling him, he was correcting him. Okay, it was probably the way in which Paul did it that even Paul acknowledged that's not what the law wants me to do under the law of Moses in reviling those who are our rulers. But Paul didn't recognize Ananias as high priest. And keep in mind the background of this. First of all, it's been at least 20 years, give or take, 17 to 20 years or so, since Paul has been a part of the Sanhedrin. Okay, that much time has elapsed. That doesn't mean that there were new high priests, every couple of years. Generally, a high priest served until he died. But whether or not the high priest that was serving when Paul was a part of the Sanhedrin, and a new one and he died, and a new one has taken his place in Ananias, there's also the added complexity to the fact that there was both the Jewish high priest and the Roman elected high priest. Keep in mind, back earlier, both in Jesus' trial and even up to Acts chapter 4, we learn about two different men that are referred to as high priests. Do you remember their names? Jesus was examined before both of them. Caiaphas was one. Annas was the other. Okay, Annas was the high priest that was elected by Rome. Okay, so Rome was officially the one put in place by the Roman Empire. He's the one that led the Sanhedrin. Caiaphas was one under the Jewish law, the one that was appropriated according to what God established. So when the Jews and Pilate sent Jesus not only to Annas but also to Caiaphas, they were covering all their bases, so that no matter which way that somebody went, he was still examined by the high priest, regardless of which law they were appealing to. That's why Jesus was sent to both Caiaphas and Annas. So whether Paul, and keep in mind, at this point, what's one thing that we know Paul's having physical infirmity issues with? What part of his body do we know he's struggling with? His eyesight. Okay. Whether his eyesight was so poor, and again, it's been 20 years. Do people change in 20 years? In their looks? Okay. You take a look at your picture, say 20 years, and you go, man, was I ever that young? It's possible that at this point, 20 years has passed, he may have not seen Ananias. It's not like they had Facebook to kind of keep up with people's changes. Okay, so it's possible that just the age, the time differentiation here had kind of made it where Paul didn't recognize who Ananias was. The other aspect to it is that because of the complexity of the politics, Paul may not have known Ananias whether he was before back in Acts chapter 9 or not. Paul may not have known Ananias is currently serving as high priest. May not have known it from that perspective either. Generally speaking, you would think Paul could have recognized who it was based on what they were wearing. Now, whether or not, though, within the Sanhedrin, the high priest wore clothes depicting his state or his position as opposed to being in the temple, I don't have any information on that. So it's possible he didn't necessarily stand out from anyone else in terms of what he wore. So for whatever reason, Paul didn't recognize Ananias as being the high priest. Again, take your pick of all the different types of reasons why that could have contributed to Paul not knowing who it was. And in essence, verse 5, Paul apologizes. Okay, I did not know he was the high priest. And he quotes scripture reinforcing the fact that we're not to speak evil of the rule of our people. Not that Paul was wrong. He was right in calling out the high priest, but Paul didn't have the authority to accuse the high priest in that setting of being a hypocrite. And that's why Paul says what he says in verse 5. Anything through verse 5 at this point?
Would it have been typical for a high priest to say smack him right off the outset?
No. And that's part of the reason why Paul says what he says. Is even the high priest, under the law, there was still due process. And the high priest couldn't just circumvent the due process the law provided because he was angry at what the person said. Okay? In essence, what the high priest did was, again, for whatever reason, whenever he reacted the way that he did, he, on his own, became what we would call judge, jury, executioner, so to speak, by ordering a disciplinary action against Paul without an accusation. I mean, the high priest doesn't even say, "How dare you accuse us of not being in good conscience?" Okay? He doesn't say, "How dare you claim that you're in good conscience," when we know for a fact, or at least the accusation, if they knew of the accusations, which they probably did, that you brought Trophimus into the temple. Okay, whatever the case was. He doesn't bear any of those things out, nor does he allow the process to take place before some disciplinary action takes place. As a result, and again, I tend to think this was the high priest, Ananias, being a little bit compulsory, okay, being a little bit temperamental. And again, Paul's background, it's very likely that this played a part in this, because Paul, even though 20 years has passed, I'm sure many in the Sanhedrin still remembered Paul. I'm sure there were still many alive who were there 20 years ago when Paul was a part of the Sanhedrin. Okay, I'm sure that there was some element to this in addition to all of that, that he's a traitor. Okay, he has turned his back, and not only as a Jew, but keep in mind that for all intents and purposes, Gamaliel had been training Paul to one day take his place among the top of the Sanhedrin. Not high priest, because who of what tribe could only the priests be? The tribe of Levi. And what tribe was Paul? Benjamin. Yeah, Benjamin. We learn that in Galatians chapter 1. So because of this, the end result is that Paul was kind of looked upon not just as a traitor of the Jewish people, but a traitor in particular of the rulers. Because he could very well, after 20 years, he could have been right there among the great of the Sanhedrin, among the well-known, the powerful, the well-taught, obviously, by Gamaliel. And yet Paul has turned his back on all of that. Anything else through verse 5? All right, verse 6. So, it's interesting, verse 6, because Paul he's among, the way, he's in the midst of them. I'm picturing Paul, and then there's this circle of all of them. Somehow or another, Paul's able to see everyone. And notice it says he perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, so he cried out. Between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, I don't think it's necessarily that he knew all of these people individually, personally, to be able to tell this. Again, 20 years has passed. He didn't even recognize Ananias for whatever reason. I don't think after 20 years he'd be able to recognize specific individuals. Oh yeah, so. They're Sadducees, and these over here are Pharisees. I tend to think that he was able to perceive this based on how they were dressed. Okay, I tend to think, remember, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, these were two of the main sects of the Jews. Okay, the Sadducees, they didn't believe in spiritual realm. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe God was a spirit. They didn't believe in any of it. They didn't believe in heaven or hell. They didn't believe in any of that. They didn't believe in the resurrection also, because of the basis of all this. The Pharisees, though, they did believe in a spiritual realm. They believed in angels. They believed in a resurrection. In addition to that, the Sadducees were, I guess you could say, that they were the wealthiest of the Jewish people, partly because they put most of their stock in the physical. Okay, they put all of their focus and all of their attention on the physical. The Pharisees, not to say every one of them, but the Pharisees, remember Jesus, when he spoke his teachings about those who loved money, those who were lovers of money, that was directed to not to the Sadducees, but to the Pharisees. Because one can still have a love or a covetousness nature regarding money and not have it. Okay, and that's what the Pharisees were. Having said all that, I tend to think the reason that Paul was able to perceive this is because the Sadducees were dressed the way a Sadducean would dress, wealthy. Whereas the Pharisees, even though they wished they could dress that way because they wished they'd had the money, maybe not as much in that way that they were dressed. And to me, that's probably the best way to figure how Paul was able to perceive this. I mean, different commentaries will suggest different things in terms of like being able to personally know who was who. Again, after 20 years, maybe he could. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he was still familiar that much with the Sanhedrin and its officers and so forth. But I tend to think that the simplest explanation is, as Paul's looking around, Even with perhaps his bad eyesight, he's still able to perceive the difference between those who were Sadducees and those who were Pharisees based on how they were dressed. Any thoughts through that so far? All right, so when Paul perceives this, he cries out in the council, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." Okay. So, is Paul lying? Or did Paul just say this because he knew it was going to cause an issue among the Sanhedrin?
So discord among them so that they took the pressure off him.
Okay, so it was a distraction, first of all, okay? Yes, it did serve as a distraction, didn't it? But was it accurate? Did Paul lie? For what reason did the whole multitude get all upset at Paul in the first place?
Because he seems guilty. Clean conscience is kind of how they all sort of started.
Okay, among the Sanhedrin, okay. And that included his service as a Christian, right? His turning to Christ and becoming a Christian and an apostle. But even going back to the multitude, it had to do primarily with going to the Gentiles. Okay? Going to the Gentiles. And not only that, but what that stood for, what that represented. That God has now ended the old law that separated the Jew and Gentile and has now instituted a new covenant in which Jew and Gentile doesn't matter. Ultimately, when you boil it all down, that's what it was about. So, when Paul mentions concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, the differentiation between the old law and the new law, the Hebrew writer brings up time and time again that it is a better law based on better promises. It offers a better hope. The old law, while referencing what would come one day in Christ Jesus, could never offer salvation, could never offer the hope of the resurrection. And yet all the prophecies pointed to a time where that would be the case. And so when Paul references this, he's really referencing Christ and Him crucified, isn't he? And the basis of our hope in Christ Jesus. I mean, it doesn't matter everything else that we can look at as Christians. If it doesn't contain the promise of the resurrection from the dead, is there any hope? Even in being a Christian. Even in being baptized for the remission of my sins. If once I'm dead, and there is no opportunity to be raised from it, is there any profit? Is there anything that I gain from that? No. So really what Paul has done is he's boiled down the essence of what makes the law of Christ and the promises in Christ Jesus so important. It is this one issue that differentiates the old law from the new law when you boil it down to basics. What gives us hope? Well, the old law couldn't give us hope. The new law does, in that Christ has given us the opportunity to be raised from the dead. Okay, so Paul has boiled it down into this one statement. Yes, did he know full well that it was going to cause a problem? That's why Luke mentions in verse 6 that Paul's perceiving, here's half of them Sadducees, half of them are Pharisees. Is this going to be a big deal? Yeah, it is. But ultimately, no matter how Paul drug it out or attempted to go through kind of the hoops of the Sanhedrin, eventually were they going to get there anyway? When Paul starts explaining, well, do you speak against the law of Moses? Well, not from the civil perspective. No, I believe in the civil upholding of the Mosaic law. But when he gets to the spiritual aspect, he starts talking about the law of Christ. Eventually, what's going to come up? The hope of the resurrection. Paul just cut all that off and says, this is why I'm here. Yeah, there were all these other little specifics that these people were getting all upset about and accusing me of. But in the end, this is what it boils down to. It boils down to the hope of the resurrection. This is what differentiates me now from what I was. So, verse 7, when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, we find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. All right. So Paul, knowing the belief structure, the primary difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees had everything to do with the nature of God and the nature of the kingdom. Okay? The nature of the kingdom for the Sadducees, the physical aspects of the kingdom, that's all there was. Whereas for the Pharisees, I mean, they still believed in this physical kingdom, they still believed in a physical Messiah, but there was a deeper representation of it because of this spiritual realm in which God existed, and angels, and the resurrection. They still believed the kingdom was physical, but they had a deeper belief in this realm that they couldn't see, as the Bible teaches. So when all of this comes up, notice here in verse 8, no angel and no spirit. Yet what was it that Paul said happened when he was telling the multitude in chapter 22? When he was on the road to Damascus, what happened? Okay. Well, a bright light appeared, right? And Jesus is speaking to him from that. Then later, he's in a trance, and he speaks to Jesus then. And of course, over that period of time, other things have been revealed to Paul. And so, because of this, verse 9, there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, "We find no evil in this man." They were fully aware. Okay, as far as I mean, Luke doesn't record it, and it may have been that Paul, at some point in this process, recounted the very same thing he said back in chapter 22 to the people. But my thought process is they already knew. Either they were present at this whole thing that took place the day before in Acts chapter 22, or they'd been told. Okay, it had been recounted to them. This isn't, they know full well what Paul claimed happened on the road to Damascus as well as since. And that this is the reason for his change. This is the reason why he has gone from the law of Moses to Christ Jesus. Okay, Paul's explained all of that. So the fact that they know this is say, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, well, what spirit was it that spoke to him on the road to Damascus? Jesus. Jesus spoke to Paul. If a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. Of course, the Sadducees, all of this is bogus to them anyway, right? They don't believe in an angel. They don't believe in a bright light coming to Paul. They think they probably think he's just making it all up. But the Pharisees, I'm not sure how much of this they took at face value from the perspective that they believed everything Paul said. I don't know. And the reason I say that is because when you pit the Sanhedrin together, the Pharisees and the Sadducees against one another, I don't know if this was so much acknowledgement that what Paul was saying was true and accurate, which I would assume would mean they therefore would later become Christians. And you'd think if they believed what Paul said, that they would listen to what Paul says. Or if this was an opportunity to be at odds against each other. Because anytime you put two differing parties in one place together, they're going to find reasons to go at each other. Okay, that's going to happen. So how much of this, and again, the fact that it's the scribe speaking, if a spirit or an angel, let us not fight against God. So that means essentially what they're saying, if this is true, that means that everything Paul says is from God. And if Paul says that Jesus of Nazareth is risen, and that the law has been done away with, and that now we should be alive in Christ Jesus through baptism, if we don't do that, we're fighting against God. Whether or not they fully believed this to the point that they were willing to obey, I'm not sure. But regardless, is what they're saying accurate? Yeah, that they're right. Okay, it is wise of them to say this. But, of course, the Sadducees are not going to go along with this. There arose a great dissension. The commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the barracks. So, everywhere Paul goes, there's this problem. Yesterday, it was the people trying to kill him. Now, it's because Paul's the focal point, Paul's the one that kind of lit the powder keg, so to speak. There's this huge, I don't think the Pharisees are trying to hurt him, I would assume, especially not of the scribes, but the Sadducees, I'm pretty sure that they're not too happy with Paul. And they're not very happy with the Pharisees at this point either. And apparently this dissension, it wasn't just a lot of yelling back and forth. It sounds as though this was getting pretty physical. Such as that Lysias, the commander, is concerned for Paul's life. Okay? That should give us a little bit of indication of the gulf between the Sadducee and the Pharisee. All right? This was not just, it wasn't just political. These were deep-rooted beliefs that dictated how they perceived and interpreted the prophecies. Okay, for the Jew, and granted, politics obviously does play a part in the Sanhedrin. We've seen that time and time again in the book of Acts. But their motivation, their purpose, or at least what they've convinced themselves is, in many cases, was because many of them, like Paul, thought they were doing what was right. That belief is so ingrained and so a key component of their identity, not just as an individual, but as a nation as well. That when you like this essential differentiation between them, because of the resurrection of the dead, where you have one half of the Sanhedrin believe in it and one half don't, and all of a sudden, you have the Sanhedrin want him dead, or the Sadducees want him dead, but the Pharisees don't. He's actually upholding what we believe. Even though they may not carry it all the way to Jesus of Nazareth, him crucified, he's upholding this belief in the resurrection. He's upholding and providing proof that there are angels and that there are spiritual beings. There's a spiritual realm. As far as they were concerned, this was great, at least for their purpose. As a result, things got not just heated, they got physical. And so the commander there in verse 10 commands, he had to have the soldiers go down and take him by force from among them. Just like what happened the day before. All right, anything through verse 10 so far? Yes, sir.
In your opening remarks, you spoke about Paul and his father. I may have misunderstood. Did you say you thought he was a Greek or he? Well, then it says there that the son of a Pharisee.
Yep.
Okay, would that be because he said feeding Gamaliel and he considered himself the son of him?
No, I think this would be two main aspects. First of all, I think Paul's father was likely a proselyte, okay, because his mother was likely a Pharisee, and then when she had an influence on his father, who was a Greek or Gentile, he would become a proselyte. Okay, either way you go with that. His mother, was he the son of his mother? Sure. Generally, the Jews focused on the father in a lineage, but Paul doesn't focus on whose son was he. Okay, well, he was the son of a Pharisee. Which parent was that? It could very well have been the mother, but I tend to think that the father was a proselyte as well. Or not the mother was the proselyte. She was a Jewess, but that the father, being a Greek, he would have become a proselyte and been a Pharisee.
Or multiple generations before that.
Or multiple generations before that, sure. Yeah, that could have been. Yep. Any other questions through verse 10? Okay. So, to say that there is the purpose for which Lysias brought Paul to begin with. Lysias is looking for answers. Is he walking away with any real answers still? I mean, did he really get what he wanted in terms of the accusations being put against Paul? No. Okay. In fact, if anything, there's a whole new can that has been opened here that is kind of on a separate burner than what took place back in Acts chapter 22. So really, if anything, things have gotten more muddier and worse for Lysias, because now the one place that you thought the Jews, that these people would be mature, that he could finally get some answers, that didn't work out the way Lysias had hoped. I mean, as a commander of the Roman army, I don't blame him for wanting to do this. You would think this would have been a great opportunity for him to get the answers he wanted. It didn't work. And if anything, now he's got more questions than answers, I guess would be the point of that. So, starting in verse 11. So, he takes him back to the barracks. So, he's been in custody for a full day at least at this point. He spent the night before, after having been taken from among the people, offering his defense of the Cesarea of Antonia. The whole day passes. He has gone before the Sanhedrin. And now he's gone back to the barracks. Starting in verse 11, the following night the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome." I'm not suggesting or saying that Paul was prepared to lose faith or anything like that. That's not at all what I think is taking place. But if you had been arrested, but not really, kind of in limbo here, the people are mad at you, the Sanhedrin's mad at you, the Roman soldiers don't know what to do with you, you're still in the barracks, you're still however it is, whether he's in a prison or in a kind of house arrest type of thing, whatever it is that they're doing with him. I doubt they have him bound because there's no accusation, keep in mind. Do you think this would be encouraging for Jesus to come and to tell you, be of good cheer? Okay? Again, don't infer from that Jesus came only because Paul was having a crisis of faith. I don't believe that for a second. Okay? I think Paul was fine in terms of, I don't think he was about to turn away from his faith or anything like that. But is there any such thing as too much encouragement? Secondly, notice what Jesus tells him. As far as we know, this is the first time that Paul knows for certain he's not going to die in Jerusalem, at least not this trip. Okay? Remember before, we've noted the fact that all the warnings about what Paul was going to face in Jerusalem, Paul said, I'm prepared to die in Jerusalem. And I think Paul really thought he was going to die in Jerusalem. But now, as far as we know, for the first time, really the purpose of Jesus appearing, unless there's more dialogue here Luke doesn't record for us, if this was all that was said between Jesus and Paul, the whole point of it wasn't just to tell him, hey, be encouraged, be faithful, be of good cheer. Notice the reason why Jesus says that. Be of good cheer, Paul. Why? Because you're not going to die here. You've testified for me in Jerusalem. Had he really covered all the bases in Jerusalem now, speaking to the multitude and now to the leaders? I mean, he's pretty much spoken to everybody. Now, you must also bear witness at Rome. So Paul now knows, I'm not dying here right now. There's more for me to accomplish. There's more for me to do. And at the very least, he knows he's going to Rome. Whether or not he's going to die there, he doesn't know that yet. But he knows he's got to go to Rome. So after verse 11, Paul and the events that come forward after this, okay, I think Paul took every opportunity to be able to preach the word. Okay, he was testifying about Jesus, everything he said. He wasn't concerned about his own well-being. Okay, he did everything he could to make the best case for Christ and still utilize all the tools at his disposal, i.e., I'm a Roman citizen, is it lawful for you to do this, and so forth. But now, Paul knows he's not going to die in Jerusalem. Because of that, I tend to think there's probably, I don't want to say relief necessarily, although, I mean, from a human perspective, I think anybody would be relieved to know you're not going to die here. But it's not that Paul wasn't prepared, but now I guess you could say, I'm trying to figure out how I want to say it. It's almost as if Paul can feel freer to express himself in the ways that he wants to. I'm trying to figure out if I'm trying to say that right.
Confidence.
Well, yeah, confidence. But it's one thing to have confidence knowing or thinking you're about to die, and then having confidence knowing full well, I'm not dying here. Whatever happens, it doesn't matter. I'm not dying here. At the very least, I'm going to Rome. So it's not that Paul would change anything. I'm not saying he would change it. It's just for in his own mind, his own heart. Now he knows there's a higher authority to which he's going to be speaking. Okay, this is a matter of the Sanhedrin. This has got to go further than this. And so might that have an impact on what Paul chooses to do later in appealing to Caesar? Okay, and that's really what I'm getting to. In Acts chapter 25 and 26, when Paul's before Felix and before Agrippa, all of this has built up to that point where Paul says, I appeal to Caesar. Because Paul knows Jesus wants me in Rome. As opposed to, not to say he wouldn't have appealed to Caesar to start with, but the fact that he knows that this is what Jesus wants, that this is where he needs to be, it just kind of gives us a sense in which Paul's determination has now shifted. I guess that's probably the best way to put it. That's probably where I should have started to begin with. Paul's attention and determination was on Jerusalem, remember? Well, there was really nothing past that for Paul. As far as he knew, he was going to die in Jerusalem. He didn't know any different. Now, his focus and determination could be on Rome and Caesar, for that matter. And then whatever happens after that, the Lord wills, whatever. But now there's more for him to focus on and determine, and that affects what he's going to do in chapter 25 and chapter 26. Yes, sir.
If I read this whole story right, one of Paul's main purposes in going to Jerusalem was to take advantage of this opportunity at Pentecost to preach the gospel to as many people as he could.
Yep.
It looks like that's just been fruitless at this point.
Well,
but what the Lord reveals to him is, this is part of my purpose. Here's some more of it.
yeah.
So he has that to look forward to, and doesn't count this as just another failure on his part.
Well, in terms of opportunity, Paul has been able to at least preach. Okay, that much he has been able to accomplish. But in terms of being able to convince people regarding the gospel, which I'm sure that's what Paul is hoping to be able to do, I don't know if that's been accomplished at all. Usually in Acts, Luke records for us many people were converted, many people were taught, many people believed, whatever. Not a single word of that so far has been mentioned. That's not to say no one was impacted by Paul's statements in chapter 22, and that no one of the Sanhedrin were impacted here in chapter 23. But Luke doesn't record that anybody was converted because of it. And that's not Paul's fault, and I don't know if Paul would consider that his fault that nobody was converted. He's doing what God wants him to do. But at the same time, that was why he came to Jerusalem. He came because this is a perfect opportunity to teach and preach, especially to the Jews of the dispersion. Yes, sir.
Doesn't look like it's going to happen.
Right. And this is the end of it.
That door's closed.
Yeah. He's not going to have this opportunity again, at least not until after he gets to Rome and is released. All right. We'll stop here in Acts chapter 23. We will pick up in verse 11 and 12 next Sunday. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.